Mr. Trebig has already mentioned the events of this past week. From Alice in Wonderland, we have the expression things get curiouser and curiouser, and that's the way it seems to me. It's been an interesting week. Looking around at the state of our nation today, it would be easy for us to ask, where is truth in any of this? And today, that's what I want to do. This sermon actually fits in very nicely with Mr. Trebig's Bible study on evolution. We're going to look at the concept of truth, specifically as present in the Gospel of John, because truth is far too big a subject to cover more than that. And even with just restricting ourselves to the Gospel of John, we're going to take a cursory look. Let's go, to begin with, to John chapter 18. John chapter 18. And we're going to be reading verses 37 and 38. This is after Christ has faced the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. He has faced them, and they have been unable to get him. The only thing that they can do in order to execute him is to prove blasphemy, and they've been unable to do that, and so they decide to take him to Pilate, the Roman governor, and accuse him of insurrection so that the Romans will do their dirty work for them and execute Christ. So he stands before Pilate, and Pilate is trying to ascertain what crime has he committed that is worthy of execution. And starting in verse 37, Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" We don't know for a fact because it doesn't tell us what was going on in Pilate's mind, but many of us have assumed over the years that Pilate was being very cynical. I think that's a good possibility, but we don't know that for sure. And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." We're just going to go ahead and stop right there for the moment and just say, Pilate had this question about what is truth. That is a question that we, as Christians, we had to ask that question somewhere, maybe silently in our own minds. We had to ask that question even to start this journey of being a Christian. But it's a question that we need to continue asking as we live our lives. What is truth? It's an important part of the Christian walk. And before I actually get into the Gospel of John, I want to take a look at what Zondervan's Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible says about truth. They have an article called Truth. They divide the philosophical concept of truth into three different types. 1, moral truth. 2, ontological truth. And ontological is just a fancy word that you might say is the essence of truth. And then 3 is cognitive truth. For the moral truth, they mention that truth is an attribute of God. As such, the term speaks of his integrity, his trustworthiness, and his faithfulness. Let's take a look at John 3. John 3. And this gives us an example of how the word true or truth, they're related words, just as they are in English. John 3, verse 33, "He who has received his testimony has set his seal to this, that God is true." That is talking about God's character, his integrity. Other words that would give us the same concept would be something like faithful. God is a faithful God. If God has said he's going to do something, he has the power and he has the integrity to carry through on that promise, and it will be done. And so God is true. He's an example of moral truth. The second concept, and this is in Zondervan's what they say, is arising from the concept of one, this is ontological truth, arising from the concept of one who is wholly trustworthy is the further concept of one who is truly what he purports to be, rather than being a deceiver, living a fiction, or being an imperfect example. So this is being something to the fullest extent, not just partially. not imperfectly as human beings are. We as human beings are used to imperfection. We can never be completely, in this physical form, we can never be completely one thing or another. God can be. And we'll take a look at John 6:32. And you may not have looked at this particular expression the same way, but this is an example. John 6 and verse 32. Jesus then said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread out of heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread out of heaven." The manna from heaven was a form of bread. It was a type of bread. But Christ is saying the true bread from heaven is he himself, okay? Christ was saying that he is true. He is the full extent of what bread would be. So he's making a distinction here between the imperfect physical and the perfect spiritual. And so that is the ontological truth. God is the ontological truth in that way. And then finally, the third one is cognitive truth. And this is what Zondervan says. In God, truthfulness stems from omniscience. God knows everything. So that the attribute of truth refers in part to his perfect knowledge. Since he is creator, whatever we know depends on him. All truth is God's truth. Our cognitive abilities are his creation, and the intelligibility of nature attests his wisdom. This is expressed in John's logos concept. Logos is the Greek word that means the word. Christ is the word, but that concept philosophically refers to this idea of truthfulness, okay? And so that's what the Zondervans are saying. We'll look at John 5, one chapter earlier, verse 33. It's just one simple sentence here in John 5, verse 33. You have sent to John, and he has testified to the truth. So this is a cognitive truth. This is the truth that we perceive in our minds, the way that we might think of the word truth. Truth as opposed to a lie. Truth as opposed to fiction. Now, as I said, I'm going to limit the sermon to the Gospel of John. Why? Why did I choose the Gospel of John? Well, if you look at John's Gospel and compare it to the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are commonly referred to by scholars as the synoptic Gospels, and that just means that they see through the same perspective. They see things the same way. They are largely biographical and not heavily theological. There are theological concepts in those Gospels, but their primary purpose is portraying what happened among the disciples. John, his gospel is entirely different. And when you read through the Gospels, you can see how different it is. It is heavily theological. If you look for the word true or truth, and I did this in 4 different versions, the NASB, the New King James, the NIV, and the ESV. I looked at those 4 versions, and each of those versions, if you look at how many times either true or truth appeared in the Gospel of John compared to the other Gospels, in every single one of them, in the Gospel of John, it was more than 4 times as often that those words appeared as the other 3 Gospels combined. So John is interested in truth, and so it's a good place to learn about truth. I'm going to also read something from the background section of the introduction to the Expositor's Bible Commentary on the book of John, which will give us an idea, a window into what was going on in John's mind. This gospel was probably written at a time when the church was composed of second and third generations of Christians who needed more detailed instruction about Jesus and new defenses for the problems raised by apostasy within the church and by growing opposition from without. The Gospel of John was written late in the 1st century. The other Gospels were probably at least 30 years before. The understanding of the person of Christ that had depended on the testimony of his contemporaries was becoming a philosophical and theological problem because of the incursion of theology and philosophy into the Christian realm. Doctrinal variations had begun to appear, and some of the assertions of the basic Christian truth had been challenged. So what we have here is John wanting to defend Christianity, understanding that some strange philosophies had begun to creep into the church, and so he presents his gospel specifically so that you can understand truth, which would have been important to philosophers. There are other things he's doing too, but we're focusing on truth. So let's go now to John 4. John 4. And in this chapter, we have Christ sending his disciples into this Samaritan town, in order to get supplies. Okay? He's by himself at the well, and this Samaritan woman comes up, and he has a long conversation, which is surprising. The disciples are later surprised because here he is talking to a woman, and she happens to be a Samaritan woman, which makes it doubly bad. What in the world is he doing? So he has this long conversation with her, though, and he's interested in her and explaining things to her. We're going to read verses 23 and 24. But let me just say that she had referred to the fact, the commentator actually says that seems like she's a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that Jesus knows so much about her personal life, and she tries to deflect things onto this ongoing controversy between the Samaritans and the Jews. And that is, the Samaritans had a temple on Mount Gerizim, and they had claimed that was actually the correct temple, and the Maccabees destroyed that temple. And so there was this ongoing dispute between the Samaritans and the Jews as to where God should be worshipped. And so she asked that question about it. And Christ gives her an answer that is a little bit different from what she was expecting. And I just accidentally tried to brush something off of my iPad, and I changed chapters. So, okay. Christ says, verse 23. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. He didn't say God is a spirit, but God is spirit. He is making a distinction between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. This woman was looking at something physical, two physical locations, Jerusalem and Mount Gerizim, okay? Mount Zion and Mount Gerizim. She was looking at the physical. She was focused on something that was less important. And Christ says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. What God is interested in is the spiritual. And when he talks about in truth here, he's indicating that it has to be something in the heart, okay? It has to be something that is not just external. And so many people have looked at the ritual obligations of, and in the first century they were looking at ritual obligations. We do the same types of things too. We look at the outward so often and fail to look at what is going on in our hearts. And that is what is important. That is what is meant by truth in this particular passage, is that there has to be a desire in the heart to do what is right, to do according to what God has specified. Let's go a few chapters over to John 8 now. Now, there's, like I said, there's a ton of references to truth, and we don't have time to look at all of them. I think true or truth appears more than 40 times in 3 of those versions. I think it's 38 times in one of the versions. Multiple times that you'll see this. Now, in John 8, instead of talking to a Samaritan woman, Christ is talking to some Pharisees. And we'll pick this up in verse 31, 8:31. So Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. They answered him, we're Abraham's descendants and have never yet been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you can say you will become free? What is Christ talking about here? Is he talking about some kind of physical slavery, or is he talking about something different? He's talking about something different here. The truth will set them free. I think in some ways this is an allusion to the Garden of Eden. Because in the Garden of Eden, there was a choice made there, the choice of sin as opposed to the choice of God's way. And ever since then, human beings have been enslaved by sin. Truth is what can set us free. When we know the truth, it sets us free. So Jesus answered them, verse 34, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son does remain forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, yet you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. I speak the things which I have seen with my Father. Therefore you also do the things which you heard from your father." Again, going back to the Garden of Eden, the one they chose to follow, the one that human beings have all chosen to follow, the ones that we at one point followed. Verse 39, they answered and said to him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you are Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. But as it is, you are seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. You are doing the deeds of your father." And then they're upset by this, of course, because of what he's saying, and they make a jab back. They said to him, "We were not born of fornication." It's not just about themselves. They're actually making a jab at Christ, because Christ, everybody knew that Mary had become pregnant before Joseph was actually married her. And so I think it was a jab at him that nobody has ever thought we were born of fornication. Jesus said to them, verse 42, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and have come from God, for I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I am saying? It is because you cannot hear my word." By the way, the word "word" shows up in this passage several times. "You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. Which of one of you convicts me of sin? If I speak truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. For this reason you do not hear them, because you are not of God." That tells us something very important there. The truth cannot be understood or even perceived by somebody who is not of God. Let's move on to John 14 now. John 14. We're just getting little snippets from the Gospel of John about truth. It might be worth just reading through the Gospel sometime, specifically focused on the idea of truth. John 14 and verse 6 is we're going to look at. Now, one other thing that John does, and we don't have time to do this today, but in the Gospel of John, there are 7 statements that Christ makes, and scholars refer to them as the I am statements. And that's because in every single one of them, Christ says, "I am," followed by something else. And I am, as you are probably aware, is shorthand for the name of God. The name Yahweh is a form of the I am verb, okay? And so when Christ says I am, he's first of all pointing to his divinity, but then he defines who he is by some other word. In this particular passage, so there are 7 different statements, and Christ says I am in multiple ways in the Gospel of John. We're focused on this one in John 14, verse 6. Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." Jesus identifies himself as the truth. And this, of course, is ontological. He is the essence of truth. He is truth perfected, okay, as a reflection also of Christ. Now we'll skip a few more chapters over to John 17. And both these chapters occur after that Passover, the evening before he was crucified. This chapter is, in my Bible right here, it's called the High Priestly Prayer. Almost the entire chapter 17 in the book of John, is a special prayer. They have finished the Passover, and Christ makes this prayer so that the disciples around him are able to hear it, and then they go across to the Garden of Gethsemane. In verse 17, chapter 17, verse 17, Christ is asking the Father, he says, "Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth." Now, sanctify means to set apart, usually with the connotation of setting apart for service, for some specific purpose. The priesthood had been set apart from the rest. The tribe of Levi and the priests among them had been set apart from the other tribes. They were set apart so that they could serve in a special way. They served God, and they were there to fulfill a specific role. And so Christ is saying that his disciples, he's asking God to sanctify them in truth. So part of the setting apart is done through truth. And then he says, "Thy word is truth." Now, Christ is identified as the Word, and he's identified as truth, but so is the Bible. The Bible, which is full of who Christ is identified as the Word of God and also truth. And I think it could apply to either, because the Bible is merely what is written down so that we can comprehend who Christ is. So, sanctify them in the truth. Thy word is truth. We get set apart. We as Christ's disciples, we are set apart by truth, and we get that truth from the Word of God. This, by the way, I just submitted an article about this particular passage, but in short, what it's saying is that we have some part to play in sanctifying ourselves. We may think of God as sanctifying, and in a larger sense, it is God who sanctifies. But we play a role. And we play that role at least partly through Bible study, because it is through Bible study that we actually learn more about our Master. We learn more about our Lord, the individual whose life we are to follow, the one we are to emulate, to become more like him. That is how God, or at least partly how God, sets us apart for service. Now, let's go back to John 18, the next chapter over. We've been moving through all of these passages and just hitting certain highlights about truth. John 18. And we're going to go back to Christ before Pilate. This time we're going to start in verse 28. John 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. The Jewish leaders were focused on the external, on the physical. And it's not that that doesn't matter. I'm not saying that. But they were thinking they were not defiled. Here they are taking Christ to be crucified for a crime that he did not commit. And yet they think they're going to refrain from being defiled. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." They don't really want to go into it. So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." As I said earlier, the only way they could execute somebody, they were allowed this by Roman law, if somebody actually committed blasphemy on the temple grounds. Okay, then they could stone the person. And that's how Stephen later on was stoned. That was a legal stoning, well, legal by Roman law. Okay. That's the only way they could. But when Christ was on trial, the high priest could not, and the priests and Pharisees, they could not get their witnesses to agree on anything. And because they couldn't get them to agree, they couldn't stone Christ. And so they had this bright idea that they'd take him over to Pilate. The Romans will do anything, let them do it. So the Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die." Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Let's get into this whole argument that he was forming some insurrection. Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Again, spiritual as opposed to physical, okay? "If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore, Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" So he's still trying to figure this out. Your kingdom's not of this world, but you are a king, you're saying? Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born." This is an important expression right here. For this I have been born. That phrase ties this passage into John 1. Let's just flip back there real quick. John 1. And you see, I think it's in verse, well, the whole thing is talking about Christ coming into the world, but verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus came into this world. He was born into this world. Now, if we go back to John 18, that particular expression, "For this I have been born," ties this conversation with Pilate back to the beginning of the book of John. All through there, these 18 chapters, you see truth coming up over and over and over again. This reference coming up here right after this, "For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" We started with that. What's interesting is this is the last time the word truth, not there are a couple of references to true, but the word truth, the last time the word truth appears in the Gospel of John is when Pilate is asking this possibly cynical question, what is truth? Now imagine, if you will, what John has done. He has shown from the very beginning that Christ came into this world, that he is truth. Over and over again, he's showing this concept of truth. Christ is the embodiment of truth. He is moral truth, he's ontological truth, he's cognitive truth. All of that. And then you have Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. He symbolizes the world, the power of the world, and the world's inability to perceive or conceive of real truth. This is a very dramatic moment in history. You see the physical realm unable to comprehend the spiritual realm. What does this mean for you and me? Why is this important? As Mr. Trabig mentioned during the announcements, and even in his Bible study about evolution and the way people refuse to look at truth, we are living in a world that is growing increasingly hostile. We as Christians must remember, always remember, and keep dear the truth that we have been given. It is a privilege to be able to open that Bible and to understand God's truth. It is an honor, it is a blessing that is not available to everybody. we must always remember that God has given us truth. He's given us the ability to comprehend it and the opportunity to live and worship him in spirit and in truth.